Hello everyone. So I've spent the last few days trying to decide what to talk about for Thank God It's Friday this week. I was flitting backwards and forwards between a few ideas. But this morning I was in conversation with former president of the Methodist Conference and the chair of the Nottingham and Derby Methodist District, the Reverend Lorraine Mellor. She mentioned she had a poster in her office that says, "Life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain." It's a quote from Vivian Green. Given this serves as a perfect introduction to one of the topics I was considering, I thought it was a sign. Now, there might be fewer big words today, but I hope that some of what I'm going to share will be helpful for people. Nobody needs me to tell them in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic that life can be incredibly tough. The reality is we all go through tough times in life, with or without deadly viruses. But as Christians, we proclaim good news. But I have to tell you, the good news that is offered by Christ is not about wanting the storm to pass, but about learning to dance in the rain. The gospel of Jesus is good news in the midst of the troubles and vagaries of life. It's got absolutely nothing to do with the awful good news promoted by the so-called prosperity gospel. Jesus was a man of sorrows who was acquainted with grief. But I actually think that the Bible has far more to tell us when we are going through some of the hardest days of our lives. Now, I know too many have had to face some of these days all too recently. Now, one of my favourite passages that I hope may bring comfort at this time comes from Philippians chapter 4. And in verse 4 of that chapter, the Apostle Paul says, "Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice." Now, you may well be thinking, well, he's having a good day. He's obviously not in lockdown. In a book filled with references to joy, it is very tempting to think that he must have gone on some missionary journey and ended up sat on a beach somewhere, perhaps in Malta, with Epaphroditus wafting him with a palm branch while he lazes around in the sun. Now, it might be tempting to think that, but you'd be absolutely wrong. For there are two key emphases in the book of Philippians. The first, yes, is joy, but the second is chain. You might suggest that Paul is very much under lockdown, for he's in prison, incarcerated on a capital charge. Now, Paul does not say where he's in prison because obviously he wanted future biblical scholars to have something to speculate about. But he does reference Caesar's household in the letter. So the earliest tradition suggests he's writing from Rome. Now, if this is the right imprisonment, it's important to consider the circumstances that led to Paul being incarcerated from Rome to better understand everything that Paul says in Philippians. We know from Acts that after a very successful number of missionary journeys, Paul had returned to Jerusalem. Some believers, not opponents, but some believers, wanted him to undergo a vow and rite of purification. Paul agreed to this, and he spent 7 days completing the requirements of the vow. Now, at the end of 7 days, he was seen in the temple, and some people assumed he hadn't, but some people assumed he'd brought in his Gentile friend Trophimus. They thought he'd brought him into the temple area where Gentiles were forbidden to go. To keep a very long story short, it kicked off big time, and many people there tried to kill him that day. Now, Paul ends up appealing to Caesar to save his neck. From there he goes on to Caesarea, where he refuses to pay a bribe, and so he languishes in prison for 2 years. Eventually Festus sends him on his way to Rome. But that itself is a long journey, and there were various different shipwrecks on the way and different troubles that occurred. And actually, we might speculate that it could be up to 5 years from first going to Jerusalem that Paul then finds himself in a Roman jail writing to the Philippians. This could easily be seen as such a waste. So rather than spending 5 years furthering the kingdom on new missionary journeys, Paul has wasted these years. Paul has these wasted years under horrible circumstances, basically because some believers wanted him to be seen to be following the Jewish law. You might, of course, expect Paul to be angry, disappointed, bitter even. Certainly not full of joy when he comes to write this letter, but nothing could be so further from the truth. Now, after declaring rejoice in the Lord always, I say it again, rejoice, Paul talks about having learnt the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well fed or hungry, whether in living in plenty or in want. Now that sounds like something any of us might want to know, especially when we realise that Paul is preaching what he lives out every day. In change from circumstances beyond his control, Paul has learnt the richness of God's grace. When we find ourselves entrapped by the change of life through circumstances beyond our control, I hope and I pray we remember what Paul has to say in this crucial passage. Now, the secret that Paul has learnt comes in two parts. Firstly, Paul begins by telling the Philippians how they should cope internally. In facing dire circumstances, the starting point is rarely having to deal with the external factors. It's often to do with the internal battles that we face. Paul says, do not be anxious about anything. Now, you might already wonder how realistic this could possibly be. In life, surely anxiety is more or less guaranteed. But remember, this is not theory for Paul. This is lived experience, lived advice. What does Paul do with that internal battle, with that anxiety? Well, he takes it to God. He says, takes that which bothers you and with prayer and petition, present it to God. With prayer and petition. Why prayer and petition? Perhaps it's just to emphasize the force of that need to pray. Perhaps bring it to God and then bring it to God again. But if you know the passage well, you'll also recognise I've actually missed a bit out. Paul actually says, in prayer and petition with thanksgiving. Take it to God. Why thanksgiving? Well, not for the circumstances that he's going through, for sure. But Paul is so convinced of the sufficiency of God that in the midst of his life, in the midst of everything he's going through, in the midst of his imprisonment, he gives thanks. Thanks because God can deal with anything that seems too big for Paul. He gives thanks for that sufficiency of God. And it reminds us our security must move beyond circumstances. There are no guarantee with circumstances, but that to which is bigger than us, well, God isn't overwhelmed. And that's why when in bringing the circumstances to God, Paul says that the peace of God, which transcends our understanding, will fill our hearts. It's not natural. We cannot comprehend it. But in my ministry, I see it happen all the time. In those who've lost loved ones, those who are facing illness, those who have got mixed up jobs, those who are bereaved, people again and again experience a peace that defies our understanding. And then, for the second part of the secret, Paul tells us how to cope externally. He tells us how to face the challenges in front of us. He says, I know what it is to have little and I know what it is to have plenty. He speaks about an experience writ large on the pages of the Bible. Now, if you follow the way through the Acts of the Apostles, he was forever being attacked. And the thing which happened to him more and more often than you might imagine is he was forever being shipwrecked. I have to tell you, if I was a companion of Paul, I would never get in a boat with him. You could more or less guarantee what would come next. It can be tempting to see faith as an insurance policy against the challenges of life. But that's not the faith that the Bible speaks of. Sadly, the Bible is clear that Christians and non-Christians alike will both get sick. Bad things will happen to good people. And no one, of course, is immune from the challenges of the coronavirus. But Paul's secret is not the avoidance of trouble. Paul's secret is the resources to face the challenge. He writes, I can do anything through him who gives me strength. Whether through the example of Jesus facing pain and suffering, whether through the comfort of the Holy Spirit, or the knowledge that God is bigger than anything we will ever face in our lives, the secret is that we can do anything through him who gives us strength. So whatever you are going through these extraordinary times, do take it to God with prayer and petition and thanksgiving, and rely on God's grace to equip you to face anything through him who gives you strength. We don't know when this storm is going to end, but I hope we can keep dancing through the rain. Amen.